So again, last week we started our introduction to Masechta Tmura. We spoke about various scenarios of Bailim, and this one's the Machaper, Miskaper, this one's the Bailim, and who has the ability to do a Maisa Tmura and who does not. Afchatos v'osham on the left column. I don't have page numbers for something. It's I think it's on page 8. I think. Yeah, I think it's the beginning. It should say on the left column is 1, 2, 3, 4. Paragraph number 5. Afchatos v'osham. You have it. The besarim nechal l'kohanim ein memir elazeh shakarban karev l'shmo v'lo hakohanim azochim v'basa. Now we came to the conclusion that a ma'aseh tmura, when you say that this animal, which is chulin, should be tmura for a carbon ola, let's say, or another animal which is kadosh, maybe it would have crossed our minds, and it seems logical that there's a difference between a carbon ola, where the kohanim have no rights to eat the basar, as opposed to the kohanim ovdim in a chatos v'yasham, which are kodshim that are eaten. The basar carbon is eaten by the kohanim. Does that give them bailus over the carbon, and therefore they can implement a ma'aseh tmura? So let's say you have a chatos here and a behemoth chulin here, and the Kohen who's doing the avoda, he says, Harei zu tmura zu, maybe that tmura should be chal, and it would be valid insofar as the Kohanim are considered bailim, in quotation marks, because they eat the basar. But the answer is no. That's not enough to make them into bailim, with all due respect, because it's not their carbon. The carbon is not being brought lishmo for the sake of the Kohen. The Kohen Memele, after the carbon is brought and the Zrikas Hadam is implemented, they can eat the basar. Not the Emurim, of course, but the basar. But that doesn't make them into bailim. Truth be told, I don't know why we needed this at all, since we already determined that the bailim for Tmura is the bailim hamiskaper. And no one would entertain the idea that the Kohen who does the avoda is called the bailim hamiskaper. I'm not sure exactly why we need this Mishnah. He quotes it in a Mishnah in Tmura. Now we get on to discussion about a Bechar. Now watch what happens in the case of Bechar. A Bechar is Kadosh mi rechem imo. The Torah says that a peta rechem, meaning if this female animal gave birth for the first time, that becomes Kadosh b'kushas Bechar, and it has to be given to the Kohen. Now, who owns this animal, this Bechar? Well, it really should depend on 2 different stages or 2 different chronological sequences. At stage number 1, we'll call it T1, the Bechar has not yet been transferred over to the Kohen. So let's say the Bechar was born in my flock. It's my animal. Again, I have a chiyuv to give it to the Kohen, but at this point, I'm the bailim. And therefore, the Tmura is my Tmura. I have the domain to implement a Maisa Tmura. But obviously, once I give it over to the Kohen, which I'm obligated to do, he now makes a kinyan, and he acquires ownership. He becomes the bailim, and only he can do the Tmura. He says the following, Kolzman should be based Yisrael, as long as the Bechar is still in the property of the Yisrael who owns the animal, Shadayim lo nosel Kohen is there for the Yisrael, is the Memir. Again, he's not allowed to do this. I always have to point this out to you. Tmura is a violation of Allah, the Torah. But nevertheless, if he went in and he did it, the Tmura is chal, and it means that the Behemas Chulin attains the status of Kodesh. And in this case, the Yisrael, since he hasn't yet what's the word I want to use? Transmitted. No, that's not a good word. Transferred. Okay, he hasn't yet transferred the Bechar over to the Kohen. He's in the driver's seat, and he's capable of implementing a tmura. He's not allowed to do so, but if he does so, it's valid tmura. But Nasna Kohen, once he passed on this Bechar to the Kohen, Eina Yisrael Yochel Lahameros. Now, the immediate conclusion that I would derive here is that once the Bechar is given over to the Kohen now becomes the full-fledged owner of the Bechar, and he can do it. Doesn't that make sense? Mm-hmm. But yet, look at the next line. I'm jumping out of my seat here. I don't know what to make out of it. He says, "La'alocha gama kohanim einom yechom lahamir bo," and why not? And he quotes a machlokes about this point in the Sugyan Tmura. According to Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri, he disagrees, and the Kohanim could be Meimer the Bechar once the Nesina was implemented and they received the Bechar. And we very much identify emotionally, intellectually, with Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri. I don't know why the Chacham rejected it. Gemara Hamida Shitasa b'Bechar she'eno omed la'krova kigon Bechar balmum or Bechar bizman hazeh. So what's going on over here, Rabbi Osai, is the following. Although the Kohen, in a sense, is the Bailim, but yet the Kapara is going to accrue, he gets brownie points to the Yisrael. The Yisrael has to give it to the Kohen. The Kohen has to be makar of it. It has Kedushas Bechar, but as a result of that Krava, the Yisrael now gets credit and kapara for the fact that his Bechar that was born in his flock of sheep is being brought on the Mizbeach. So although the Kohanim have a certain element of violence, but nevertheless, the direction, what's the word I want to use? The designation of this Bechar, as far as Kapar is concerned, points us back to the Yisrael who gave and transferred the Bechar over to the Kohen. But there'll be cases in which the animal, which was given to the Kohen, will not be brought on the Mizbeach. For example, if let's say the Bechar gets a mum, and a Baal mum is possible l'Mizbeach. Or alternatively, Bizman hazeh, we don't have the Beis HaMikdash today, so the Bechar now is not brought on the Mizbeach, obviously. In these cases, there is Tmura. Again, I would highly discourage a Kohen from doing this, but if a Kohen did a Tmura action, he will effectively create a status of Hegdesh to the Behemoth Chulin through the method of Tmura. And why is that so? Because the Yisrael's bias on this Bechar is limited or reaches its expression in the Akrav al Gabi Mizbeach. But Lu Yitzuyur, there's no Akrav al Gabi Mizbeach, then the bias of the Kohen now becomes full-fledged bias. What prevents his ownership from reaching fruition, even though technically in Choshev Mitzvah terms he is the owner of the Bechar, the Kohen, but it's the fact that he is obligated to bring this Bechar in the Mizbeach for the sake of the Bailam, who would mafresh the Bechar and gave him an Asina. But if we block the possibility of Hakravas HaBechar in one of these two ways that we mentioned, then the Kohen becomes the full-fledged Bailam over the Bechar, and therefore he can be Meimer. Now he goes on to another category, another case, Yorish. So Reuven was Magdish and Ola, let's say, but he died, and now his son Chanoch inherits that animal. Nechluku tanoim Yorish Meimir Karban Sheyorash, which again, according to our understanding, would be dependent upon the following issue, and there are two sides to this issue. Is the Yoresh bringing the carbon on behalf of his deceased father, or is he bringing it on his own behalf? Because now that he inherited it, he becomes the full-fledged Bailam, even as far as the Kaparas HaKarbon is concerned. If it's the former, then he cannot be Meimer because he's only bringing this carbon on behalf of his father. If, on the other hand, we say that he became the full-fledged Yoretz, full-fledged owner of the carbon, and he's bringing it on his own behalf, he could be Meimer. Nechluku tanoim v'mayoresh Meimer carbon sheyorash. Ulalocha Meimer. Which I assume he's paskening based on the Rambam. Let's see. Yeah. So the Gemara is in Tmura and Afchaf, and the Rambam is in Tmura Perek Alpha Halacha Hey. And you'll ask me, V'af, how can you maintain? How can you justify? How can you justify this position that the Yoresh is Meimer? How can he be Meimer? He's bringing the carbon on behalf of his father, his deceased father, who is mafresh the carbon. And clearly, in this case, the miskaper is the father, not the son, which we wanted to vacillate about that point. That maybe once the father dies, then the kapara power, like the violence over the mumminess of the zevach, accrues to the son. No, that's not so. The son is bringing a kapara on behalf of his father. Why then can he be meimer according to that Shitas Tanoim, which we accept halacha? He says, "V'af shenaka miskaper ose tmura mikolonko meimer." The Yoresh is meimer. Why lefisha Yoresh miskaper bekarban aviv mikufya. And this is already a sugya Masechtas Zvachim that there's such a thing as a kapara mikufya, meaning there's the primary miskaper and then there's the secondary miskaper. A carbon has such power to generate kapara that it could split and bifurcate in two different directions. You could have the ikar miskaper, and the main kapara is on behalf of Ruvain, and then there's a mikufya, sort of like a surface level kapara, that is Chanoch ben Reuven in this case of the Yoresh. He also gets a kapara. Not a full-fledged kapara, but like a surface level kapara, which is called mikufya. And the chiddush here is that a kapara mikufya is enough to generate a shame violence such that you can now implement a ma'aser. Now, by the way, I mean, this is more of a hashkafa point. How could it be that Reuven died and would bring a carbon on his behalf? He's already dead. But the answer is that Mason miskaper, that there's kapara even for Mason. Anybody think of any example of that? A kapara for Mason? Obviously, the Yoresh of a carbon, but any other examples?
I remember we learned this.
I'll give you a great example. You all know that there's an institution called Yizkar. I mean, back in America, when I was brought up, even Jews who would not show up for anything on Shabbos, they would come for Yizkar. You know, it's a big deal. And for the shul, it was good stuff, you know, but for many reasons. But what's this all about Yizkar? You know, we're remembering the deceased, but the answer is the original Yizkar, by the way, was only one day in the year. Anybody know which day that was? And the original Yizkar, then they spread it out. But Yom Kippur, only on Yom Kippur. There's only Yizkar on Yom Kippur. Because on the day of Kapara, which is Yom Kippur, the Mason need Kapara. And our recitation of Yizkar magically generates a Kapara for the Mason. And I'll give you another example, Vidu. We recite Vidu on Al Shem HaMesim. Anachnu v'avosenu chatanu. And our Vidu somehow generates magically a kapara for the Mason, for our fathers and our grandfathers. How that operates, don't ask me, because that's already metaphysics. But there is kapara for Mason. In fact, the Gemara says that during the first year of Avelus on behalf of one's parent, a son or a daughter should always repeat the words Hareini kaparas michkava, that I should be a kapara for my deceased father. Now, why that only lasts for 1 year, I don't know. But probably even my father, for example, is gone. I don't know. I lose count. It's well over 25 years, like probably 30 years. Let's see, how old was I? Yeah, it's close to 30 years. I'll still remember when I went out. I went out with my wife to eat something after my mother died. My father died first and my mother died second, quite a few years later. So I remember somebody was coming to collect. He was a man close to my age. He was probably about 40. And when he put his hand out, he said, Ani yatom, I'm an orphan. So my wife pointed to me and she said, Gam hu yatom. I didn't realize that I was a yasam, when my mother died. Like the asimon didn't fall, But in any event, there is a law of haredi kaparas mishkava, and I think that would apply even 100 years after you lost your parent. So there is kapara for Mason, and in this case of the Yoresh, he's going to bring the karba that was designated by his father or his mother on behalf of his parent. And therefore you would think he cannot be Meimer, but La'aloch the Ram Paskins, he can be Meimer. And the reason is because he, the Yoresh, has another element of kapara, which is called mikufya. It's a quasi kapara of some sort. Lashon HaTmuras. Am I right that that's the next paragraph on the next page? Mm-hmm. Okay. If I skip a page, let me know. Which reminds me, I have to order a Gemara Tmura. Call it my son. Anyway, Kamal Lashonis Lamaisa Tmura. Omer Zu Tmura Zu Tachaz. Well, that's a big chiddush. If you say Zu Tmuras Zu, that's crystal clear that you're implementing a Maisa Tmura. But Zu Tachaz Zu, that's a little bit of a broader kind of expression of Tmura. But apparently that's viable as well. This is a Gemara in Masechta Tmura Chavav and Beis. He writes in the footnote here, in Yeshlo Behemas Hegdesh, Balas Mum, Biniach Yodo Behemas Hegdesh, the Omer Zutach Hazu, a razor pigeon the Eno Chilu. All right. This is way beyond our level. Zu Khalifas Zu. So the word Tmura has a number of synonyms in Lashon Kodesh. Tmura means a replacement. And chiluf is to replace something, to exchange something. So therefore, arezu tmurasi and arezu chalufasi, in the case of kaparas, but here, arezu tmurasu, arezu chalifasu, those are identical terms. Now, which languages or formulations are excluded from Tmura? Zu mechuleles al zu. Now, the word mechuleles indicates that I'm trying to remove the kedusha. That's called chil, or otherwise known as pidyon. The two concepts are very, very similar. The distinction between them, the difference between them is kichut hasaira, is very subtle. In the case of tmura or chalufa, what I'm saying is that I'm not touching the kedusha of the original animal. I'm just replacing it. But mechuleles means that my action is directed towards this behemas kodesh, and I want to strip it of its status of kedusha, so that I can take that status of kedusha and place it on something else. That's called pidyon. So again, you've got two animals in front of you. We'll call the Behemas Kodesh A and the Behemas Chulin B. If your statement is directed at B, then it's a valid Tmura. But if your statement is directed at A, in the case, I'm sorry, did I say A? I meant to say B, right? So, which one? No, I got it right. Okay. So right. So if you're looking at B and trying to upgrade B from Chulin to Kodesh, that's called Tmura. But if you're looking at A, which is a Behemas Kodesh, and you're trying to strip it of its Kedusha, of its status as Hegdesh, that's called Chil or Pidyon. That's not Tmura. Again, in both cases, the ultimate agenda or goal is identical. That this Behemas Chulin should replace the Behemas Kodesh, and the Behemas Kodesh should no longer be Kodesh, but the Behemas Chulin should be Kodesh, no matter which way he says it. But in terms of the modus apparatus here, the modus vivendi of how it works, there are radically two different ways to work that. You can either set up the Behemas Chulin as Kodesh Memela, meaning as a result, by stripping the Kedusha from the Behemas Kodesh, and as a result, placing that Kedusha onto the Behemas Chulin. That's not Tmura. Tmura means that I upgrade this animal of Chulin and set it up as a replacement for the animal that's Hegdesh. That's what Tmura is. So therefore, Mechuleles ein zu lashon Tmura ela ma'aseh pidyon. V'gam im ein behemas ha'hegdesh balas mum, ulefichach ein yecholim lifdosa, ein behemas ha'chulin nitfeses b'kedusha. You know, you could, if not for this last chiddush here, you could have said the following. Okay, if the behema of Hegdesh is a balmum, which means that I have the option of being mechalalit. So therefore, when I say arei zu mechuleles al zu, I'm just implementing what I really should be implementing, which is a pidyon and a chil, which is exactly what we do with psulei hamikdashim, with a balas mum. But in a case where the behema of Kodesh is a tam, not a balmum, then chil is completely erroneous, and it's not valid. So therefore, what he really is doing is tmura. No. It doesn't matter whether it's valid or invalid, whether or not he has the potential of chil and pidyon or he doesn't have it. Even in the case of a tam, if he uses the wrong language, which indicates the wrong mechanism, then it doesn't get off the ground, and it's not tmura. And the mechanism that he's using, which again is ridiculous, namely chilul, you can't be mechalel a behemas kodesh, it's kedusha saguf, it doesn't lend itself to pidyon until it becomes a mum. Nevertheless, that's what he did, or that's what he tried to do. And he fell flat on his face. Not only was he unsuccessful in implementing chilul, which you can't do in a behemas town, but even the tmura Hegdesh, he cannot successful. In the footnote, he tells you where to find this in Masechta Tmura, Daf Chaf. He has a sugya Daf Yud Zayin. Now, my photocopy came out a little bit dark here on the second page, but let me see if I can make it out. It says, a Rambam Hishmit ofen zeh mechal ofanan shetmura chala af betos. Has a Mishnah. No, I don't know. Not sure what this is. Omar. Now let's see if we can guess what's going to be the ruling in the next case. In other words, I want to look at the scenario, but cover the text if we can play that game. Teitze zu v'tikones zu. Now, Bosai, what would be your knee-jerk reaction? Either put your finger up, which means it is a Maisa Tmura, or put your finger down and say, no, this is not a Maisa Tmura. I agree with John. Steve, I don't see your finger. Oh, you think it would be Tmura? Okay, so you have Machlok Sachrona. I don't think this could be Tmura because, again, what is the object of his statement? Is it the Behemas Kodesh or is it Behemas Chulin? He's looking at the Behemas Kodesh and he says, Teitze Zu, V'tikane Zu. But as usual, there's always complications. He says, V'hoisa Behemas HaHegdesh Tmima, She'ein Ba Pijon, the Afshe Kavanos Lamaisid Pijon, Mikol Makom Areza Bechlal Mashoninu Shatmura Chala Af Pitos V'Chalat. Man, to put the building blocks together, I mean, we're really starting from scratch here. Trying to figure out what Tmura is all about. This is a toughie. In the case where he says mechuleles, we didn't bat an eye, and we said that's not Tmura. And it matters not whether the Behemas Kodesh is a tam or a mum, al mum. But now we're saying that Teitze Zu V'tikane Zu. Oh, so look at this. At least we're in good company here. Misery loves company. Take a look at footnote number Chaf Hey. On the second line, he says, Be'ikar din zeh kvar hikshu hachronim ma chiluk yesh bein mechuleles she'ena tmura l'teitze zu v'tikane zu. We're in good company. He doesn't even offer an answer. He tells you to look in the Rashash. Maybe the Rashash has it. The only thing I could say here, which is only 50% of an answer, it's not a full answer, is let's differentiate between two methods or two scenarios. In case number one, he realizes full well that he can't have his cake and eat it, meaning he cannot accomplish what he wants to accomplish and replace the second carbon for the first carbon. He's aware of that. What he's unaware of is which methodology is recognized and validated by the halacha. So if you interrogate him, ask him what his goal is, he says Tmura. Ask him whether Chilul will be meaningful here, he says absolutely not. So on the one hand, he wants Chilul, he wants Tmura, and he knows that Chilul is impossible. He's got an animal that's not a balas mum, she's a tam. But what he mistakenly did was he used the wrong language and applied the wrong methodology. He used a mechanism which is totally off base here. He said, "Harezu mechuleles." You can't say "Harezu mechuleles." Tmura means zu tachazu or zu tmura zu. You got to start with the behemoth chulin. He wanted to end up with the behemoth chulin, so he fluked up the whole methodology. But when he says, and let's get the language down straight, Teitze zu v'tikane zu, now that's indicative of a certain naivete. Now, certainly his goal is tmura, like in the previous case. He would like the zu, the second zu, to replace the first zu. However, what he's unaware of is the fact that tmura doesn't operate in this way. That you cannot use chilul as a replacement for tmura. And that becomes what's called tmura b'tos. Tmura b'tos means that he was unaware of the fact that this is an invalid method. His language is reflective of that invalid method. But we know clearly what his goal is, and that's tmura. We will fix up his language such that it fits in and it's appropriate for tmura, even though his language was improper, but he didn't realize that you can't do tmura in that way. He thought that this method is a valid method of tmura. So as in the first case, when he says mechuleles, he's aware of the fact that not only does he want to achieve tmura, but he's aware of the fact that there is no chilul on a behemoth's tam. There's no element of tos here. He just didn't get himself energized enough to use the right formulation to create that tmura. And we can't help him in that. But in a case where he made a tos and he thought, wait a minute, maybe I can pull off a chilul instead of a tmura and it'll accomplish my goal of tmura, that's already a tos. And if it's a tos, then we have a right to fix up his language so that it's matim. How do you say in English? It's matim. It's appropriate or fits his goal. All right. So we're up to Isra Tmura. We haven't discussed, we've assumed straight along that there's an Isra doing Tmura, but we haven't discussed the sources for that and the scope of that Isra. So let's just make a note that we got up to number Beis over here. Now, one second. I hope this is okay.